Our keynote for tonight is Lenore Langsdorf. Lenore Langsdorf is a professor emerita from Southern Illinois University and currently also teaching and have access to at University of Texas, San Antonio. The title of her talk is Post-Phenomenology in the Human Sciences. And so I wanted to actually tell a stories to sort of introduce Lenore. So I know I feel this is bad, but I wouldn't be where I am without Lenore, and I think that's important sort of to say. So when I went to do my graduate work at Purdue University, so there's two moments where I would not be here tonight if not for Lenore. I'll tell both of them. So the first was I had a great doctoral program in philosophy. I loved interdisciplinary work, and so Purdue had two joint programs. You could do a PhD. A dual PhD in both philosophy and communication or philosophy and literature. And so it was a couple extra years of coursework and you got this sort of dual degree, and I love that kind of stuff. And so I was trying to decide, which one should I do? And I went to one of my mentors and said, well, what's more philosophical? Are there more phenomenological communication people or more phenomenological literary English people? And so my mentor said, I know this one woman, Lenore Langsdorf, you should read some of her work. And I did, and I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go into communication and philosophy. So it was reading her work that kind of got me. And then I remember meeting Lenore and saying, hey, I'm where I am because of you, and I wouldn't have gone into communication without your kind of work in phenomenology and communication. And I mentioned where I was from. He said, well, your teachers were kind of were mentors of mine as well, and so make sure you pay this forward. And so she's always been very welcoming to students and to colleagues, and when it's hard to find places that accept and support phenomenological work. And I know I could reach out to Lenore, and when I said, hey, I'm a grad student, where can I present phenomenology and communication? Because the communication studies is all most of them are empirical, and I thought they were like you, were going to be phenomenological. And so she said, well, there's this group called SPHS. And so without her kind of mentoring me and pushing me on panels and into leadership, and I definitely would not be here. So I feel a ton of gratitude to Lenore, and her service to SPHS, behind the scenes, those who, even when she's not here, she's our treasurer, she's constantly doing stuff for the organization, and to me, she's the face of the organization, and she's been the face of phenomenology and service for many years. So she was the first woman to be president of SPHS, the Society for Phenomenology and Existential Philosophy. She's written countless books and articles, and a PhD from Stony Brook, so I know we had a lot of Stony Brook people. It's nice to see that here this year, and just a wonderful human being. So I'm just really happy to have Lenore here, and she's going to talk about post-phenomenology in the human sciences for us. So let's welcome Lenore Langsdorf.
What an introduction. I have to add to it that we both wouldn't be where we are if it wasn't for Cal Schraug, who was at Purdue at the time teaching in that program. I learned a lot from Cal, and he did too. So we pass it on, as you mentioned. Right. You may not have heard the title that very clearly, so I'll repeat it. Post-phenomenology in the human sciences. I thought, as I mentioned, when the title was delayed, I kept thinking, what should be the subtitle for that? What should I add? I don't need one. As long as I emphasize the in and the post, you have some sense of what might be coming toward you, right? This is the George Psathas lecture at this year's meeting. We have fewer post-phenomenology folks, and for the first time in many years, not any post-phenomenology sessions this year. Largely, I think, because of our unusual scheduling, right? So this may be the only time we hear that term, right? But if you haven't heard it before, if you don't know what it is, this will probably tell you something about what it is, right? I'm not sure if I need my reading glasses with this or not. Let me try with, that might be clearer. The George Psathas lecture. Right. Whoop. Jochen, have I upset your system here? Is it okay?
It's fine.
Okay. There are two observations by sociologists that are basic for my consideration of the usefulness of post-phenomenology in human science research. Since this is one of a series of lectures honoring George Psathas, I'll begin by quoting from a paper he presented at the American Sociological Association in 1967, when most folks in this room were not on this earth. Pardon me, quoting from George then. The distinction between natural science and social science, as Nathan, Schutz, and others clearly point out, is based on the fact that we are not only objects existing in the natural world to be observed by the scientist, but we are creators of a world, a cultural world, of our own. The grounding, of ethnomethodology in phenomenology implies that research problems will be defined and approached in such a way as to result in the discovery of the essential features of the social phenomena being investigated. George concluded that paper with his consideration that, and I'll indicate quotes with my fingers, his consideration that the main aim of social science is not an understanding of behavior in the laboratory, but behavior where it occurs in everyday life. The second observation is by Ken Lieberman from the inaugural George Psathas lecture at the annual meeting of the Society for Phenomenology and the Human Sciences in Eugene, Oregon, back in 2013. He entitled his lecture, "What Can the Human Sciences Contribute to Phenomenology?" So I've stolen his title, changed it around a bit. He noted two problems in classical phenomenology. The first is that classical phenomenology tends to overemphasize what is rational, what's predicative, predicative, and conceptual cognition. The second is that classical phenomenology tends to overly emphasize what is individual, even though Husserl from the beginning recognized the importance of intersubjectivity, he remained a prisoner of the Enlightenment. Ken's ethnomethodological practice, as he is very aware, incorporates George's aim. Throughout, Ken's focus is on behavior where it occurs in everyday life, whether that's in a monastery, a coffee tasting room, or at street crossings, to name just a few of his research sites. I'll return to this point at the end of these remarks. Now though, before considering how post-phenomenology responds to these emphases on individuality and rationality, I need to note that although I share Ken's and George's basis in sociology, I hope that this consideration of post-phenomenology's contribution to the human sciences is applicable to the breadth of disciplines present in SPHS, including communication. The extent of that relevance may depend on the extent to which phenomenology provides an alternative to the two problems that Lieberman notes in classical phenomenology: overemphasis on rationality and individuality. In what follows, I'll first refer to a few specifics about how post-phenomenology avoids those overemphases, and then go on to share more about what I believe is the positive contribution that post-phenomenology offers to the human sciences. So, in regard to rationality, post-phenomenological research moves away from the overemphasis on rationality that Lieberman notes in understanding intentionality as directness, and does not accept either the everyday association with determining or planning, or the more general philosophical sense, as reported in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, quoting from them. Intentionality is the power of minds to be about, to represent, or to stand for things, properties and states of affairs. The puzzles of intentionality lie at the interface between philosophy of mind and the philosophy of language, unquote. Post-phenomenological research, in contrast to both of those senses, emphasizes an embodied and cultural, rather than mentalistic or linguistic, sense of intentionality. It relies upon a concept of reason that's quite different from the concept that Husserl criticized in The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. Ian Angus summarizes the goal of Husserl's criticism in this way, quoting now from Angus in a recent book. The crisis in question is a cultural issue that concerns psychology and philosophy, especially since they deal with the enigma of subjectivity that pertains to their central subject matter and method. But this enigma also accounts for, quoting now from Husserl, insoluble obscurities in modern, even mathematical sciences. It's the end of the Husserl quote. If factual sciences are divorced from subjectivity, which is the ground for meaning and evaluation, the reason that they produce turns into nonsense because their cultural significance remains unknown. Therefore, the goal of Husserl's crisis is to rescue subjectivity from its loss within the objectifying modern sciences in order to propose a phenomenological concept of reason that can ground reason, meaning, and value. So, end of the Angus quotation. The phenomenological concept of reason that's intrinsic to Husserl's rescue of subjectivity relies on both the directedness that characterizes intentionality and constitution, as well as an aspect of human behavior that he explored in manuscripts that Husserl wrote during the last 2 decades of his life, and that I'll focus on later in these remarks, namely passive synthesis and affect. The Crisis incorporates manuscripts written during 1934 to 1937. Due to its focus on the life world, it may be the work that's most known by human science researchers. Prior to those manuscripts, during 1918 to 1926, Husserl wrote the manuscripts that we now know of as Analyses of Passive and Active Synthesis. To the extent that affect is incorporated in current phenomenological research on behavior in everyday life, post-phenomenology can direct us away from that abstract concept of reason that Husserl rejected in The Crisis, and toward a concept of reason that relies upon pre-predicative, embodied, and relational cognition by creators of the cultural world where it occurs in everyday life. That's quoting from Psathas with my emphasis. To the extent that post-phenomenology understands reason and thus our behavior in the life world as reliant upon the better-known concept of reason that employs active syntheses and the lesser-known concept of reason that employs passive syntheses, post-phenomenology provides and prefers an alternative to the overemphasis on rationality that Lieberman recognizes in classical phenomenology. In regard to individuality, Psathas' goal, discovery of the essential features of social phenomena, is furthered through a crucial difference between classical and post-phenomenology, namely multi-stability. Dionydi characterizes this difference in this way. In Husserl's earlier use, variations were needed to determine essential structures or essences. But as I used this technique, I discovered something other than Husserlian essences as results. What emerged or showed itself was the complicated structure of multi-stability. Eide found that multi-stability is reciprocally co-constituted by humans and things, including technological artifacts and especially instruments. Post-phenomenological research considers the things themselves, to which Husserl directed us, as intrinsically enmeshed within historical, material, and socio-political contexts, which nurture us as creators of and creatures within a cultural world. Things, including technological artifacts, are intentional in the phenomenological sense of being directed toward, and post-phenomenology finds a mutual relationality that is accomplished by the methods, skills, and techniques that are incorporated within things. As Eide notes, if we humans invent technologies, then reciprocally, our technologies reshape our life worlds, and thus us within those life worlds as well. Both animate and inanimate things communicate. They interact, interrelate, demonstrate multi-stability, and do so mutually rather than individually. Insofar as post-phenomenological, I wish it had a different name. Insofar as post-phenomenological thinking begins with acknowledging of multi-stability and recognizes the importance of affect, it balances the forethought and planning of designers, inventors, parents, and teachers, and voters with the reality of an ongoing flow of diverse possibilities, each of which challenges our desire to influence or even determine the character of those things. As Don Eide has noted, the designer's intentions play only a small part in the subsequent history of the artifact. That skepticism is evident in Eide's warning of prognostic predicaments, quoting, "If philosophers are to take any normative role concerning new technologies, they will find, from within the structure of technologies as such, and compounded historically by unexpected uses and unintentional consequences, that technologies virtually always exceed or veer away from intended design." End of the quote. Now we learn from Husserl that perception is intentional, directed, and constitutive, formative, both active and passive, and that cognition focuses upon the things themselves rather than upon ideas. Yet insofar as Husserl's goal of developing phenomenology as a rigorous science focused upon knowledge of the essence of the things themselves, classical phenomenology adopted an epistemology focused on stable essences. Within classical phenomenology, essences seem to be isolated from the dynamic life world in which things are experienced. Thus, the prevalent conception of Husserlian phenomenology is an idealism rooted in consciousness. Eide's hybrid phenomenology rejects that conception. Quoting again from Don Eide, "In both pragmatism and phenomenology, one can discern what can be called an interrelational ontology. By this I mean that the human experiencer is found to be ontologically related to an environment or world, but the interrelation is such that both are transformed within this relationality." To the extent that post-phenomenological research understands individuality as ontologically related to the environment or world, as coming to be intrinsically enmeshed within historical, material, and socio-political contexts that nurture us as creators of and creatures within a cultural world, as individuals who are reciprocally and mutually shaped and reshaped by those relations. Post-phenomenology provides an alternative to the overemphasis on individuality that Lieberman recognizes in classical phenomenology. In reflecting on the differences between traditional and post-phenomenology, Eide provides these clues. The relationality analysis, the central emphasis upon variational theory and its resultant multi-perspective and multi-stable ethics, the emphasis upon extended embodiment, while drawing upon classical phenomenological thinking, are not strictly modeled on the older phenomenology. In regard to what interferes with, or perhaps stimulated the replacement of, that older phenomenology, Eide goes on to say that, a favorite quote, "He read and liked Whitehead many years ago, but his special vocabulary of neologisms put me off. It is John Dewey who rises to more importance in this hybridization of phenomenology and pragmatism, that after considering various options was named post-phenomenology. I wish he had stayed with pragmatic phenomenology." But the student can't correct the teacher, sometimes. A few comments are needed then about post-phenomenology's relation to Dewey's pragmatism. Eide's recent work continues to affirm a closeness to Dewey's pragmatism that's particularly significant in relation to the concept that's important for a relational metaphysics. Pardon me. Intentionality. In commenting on his early naming of the hybrid we know as post-phenomenology, Eide notes, "What I first called a non-foundational phenomenology and later retitled post-phenomenology is in effect precisely a pragmatic phenomenology. I agree with Larry Hickman's assessment Ides' post-phenomenology and Dewey's pragmatic technology are much closer relatives than they might appear on the surface. An aspect of this closeness that deserves mention is the predominance of interest in technology in recent sessions at our annual meetings. Post-phenomenological research demonstrates a broad definition of that term. Mark Johnson relates the broad sense to Dewey's usage, quoting now from Mark Johnson. If we can get beyond our overly narrow traditional model of technology as the application of bodily skills to shape materials for the realization of certain pre-given ends or affairs, states of affairs, that is, as manipulation of means to realize ends, we can understand technology in general as any intelligent, skillful means for transforming experience. This is the expansive sense in which Dewey understands this term. Technology signifies all the intellectual techniques by which the energies of nature and man are directed and used in satisfaction of human needs. It cannot be limited to a few outer and comparatively mechanical forms. Quoting again from Mark Johnson. So, this leads me to metaphysics. Despite the off-putting barrier presented by Whitehead's reliance upon neologisms, I also find a closeness of Ides' post-phenomenology and Whitehead's metaphysics. I noted in the previous article that post-phenomenological interrelational ontology describes what is in the environment and the myriad possibilities for things offer to imaginative investigation. But it does not venture into a metaphysics that proposes how these entities have their being. For that inquiry I proposed in that article, post-phenomenology needs, quote, a process metaphysics that provides a theory of how interrelation produces novel entities. This is quoting from myself. In what follows, I'll sketch the outlines of such an approach to metaphysics in order to focus on how entities come to be, and go on to consider the importance of Husserl's late work for recognizing entities' intrinsic relationality in contrast to the earlier emphasis on individuality, and the importance of affect in contrast to an emphasis on rationality. Although there's a growing recognition of the relevance of Deweyan pragmatism in post-phenomenology, there has been scarce attention to the potential value of Whitehead's ways of process relational philosophy for post-phenomenology. There are two difficulties that stand in the way of recognizing and utilizing the closeness of Whitehead's metaphysics. The first is that special vocabulary about which Dewey has to say in his review of Process and Reality, Whitehead's text, at the time of its initial publication, quoting now from Dewey back in 1929. Understanding of particular sentences requires understanding of the system as a whole and vice versa. Another and perhaps greater difficulty in reading Whitehead resides in his vocabulary. Until one has gone far in grasping his whole thought, the vocabulary is likely to be a stumbling block. True. The closeness of Whitehead's process relational metaphysics to Ides' interrelational ontology is obscured by that off-putting special vocabulary. Yet Whitehead's philosophy provides a path for understanding intentionality and constitution as relational concepts, an understanding that's vital for extending post-phenomenological thinking from description of what is to recognition of the pre-predicative and affective character of entities' formation. Granted, that path needs to be cleared of the stumbling blocks provided by neologisms. I'll offer a brief explication of three themes, the basic for that clearing. The first basic theme is process. Western philosophy, with few exceptions, presupposes a subject and predicate form of thinking. There are substances that are basically stable and predicates that are, in philosophical terms, accidental to those substances. Whitehead's philosophy of organism, that's his term, is one of those exceptions. It inverts that order. Quoting now from Whitehead, The philosophies of substance presuppose a subject which then encounters a datum and then reacts to the datum. The philosophy of organism presupposes a datum which is met with feelings and progressively attains the unity of a subject. The second basic theme is feelings. This, Whitehead insists, is a mere technical term chosen to suggest that functioning through which an actual entity appropriates the datum. It designates how elements or aspects of the environment coalesce within a relational process to form actual entities, things. Both animate and inanimate entities are formed in a dynamic process of incorporation and rejection of elements. The flowers in my garden accept moisture and chemicals from the earth in which they're planted and from rainwater. An artificial flower set into the same soil will reject those same elements. Both processes, acceptance and rejection, demonstrate feelings, respectively positive and negative feelings. This is not to say that sentient and sapient creatures, entities such as animals, including humans, have the same feelings, methods, and modes of accepting or rejecting data as do flowers. It is to say that the process of individuation is similar in all entities and need not rely upon conscious choice governed by rationality. The third basic theme is relation. These occasions of experiencing data are intrinsically related to one another and to the environment that provides them. Whitehead emphasized that we essentially arise out of our bodies, which are the stubborn facts of the immediate relevant past. We are also carried on by our immediate past of personal experience. Individuals, actual entities, emerge as data encounters feelings. We become who we are as we progressively unite encountered environmental data from which we creatively generate our own individuality. I seem to be knocking this thing regularly, sorry. Even when we negotiate around the neologisms, the contrast between Whitehead's reliance upon those themes and Husserl's predominant focus on consciousness and a method for discovering essences creates a second difficulty for acknowledging the usefulness of Whitehead's metaphysics within the hybrid that is post-phenomenology. That contrast is challenged by Husserl's work during the last decades of his life, and especially in manuscripts that remained unpublished, although consulted by others for many years. That work offers another path to the process-relational metaphysics that's needed in acknowledging the value of post-phenomenology for research in the human sciences. It's a path that, at least for those familiar with classical older phenomenology, does not rely on novel vocabulary. It relies instead on the broader focus in Husserl's late work. His investigation shifted from the static analyses that began with theoretical entities that do not undergo or undertake change, the philosophy of arithmetic and logical investigations, to genetic analysis focused upon constitution in the life world of individuals. Yet in the last 2 decades of his life, Husserl increasingly investigated the historical and social context that generates and supports those individuals. His investigations of the life world as presented in the Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology identified that context as one threatened by the mathematization of the sciences that ignored the roles of history and culture in the formation of human beings. In what follows, I follow Anthony Steinbeck's understanding of Husserl's attention to a pre-given life world in the crisis as requiring a shift from static structural analysis of how things are given to genetic analysis of individual constitution, and then to generative analysis of sense constitution, which takes place historically, geologically, and intersubjectively within normatively significant life worlds, quoting Steinbeck, that include both nature and culture. This requires a focus upon historical and intersubjective becoming that utilizes sedimentation and expectation gained from natural, cultural, and pre-theoretical experience. The projects of communicative and embodied members of the life world are those that are of interest to research in the human sciences, And in what follows, I focus on affect as a key aspect of those projects. Yes. Thanks. Extensive investigation of primordial levels of the formation of individuals, rather than constitution by individuals, remained in manuscript form until the 1966 publication of Analyses Psathas and Synthesis, although those investigations were known to and used by others, especially Merleau-Ponty. The English translation by Anthony Steinbeck in 2001, Analyses Concerning Passive and Active Synthesis, includes translations of manuscripts in which Husserl investigated both those primordial levels and the active synthesis of sense constitution, which at a higher level inform logical structures. Steinbeck notes that what is central to these new concrete investigations is the phenomenon of affection or affective force. By affection, Husserl does not mean a causal stimulus, a contextless power, or a third-person force. Rather, Husserl understands the exercise of an affective allure on us, an enticement on the part of the object, a motivational, not causal synthesis or solicitation to pull to attentiveness. Affection is an essential condition for every kind of synthesis. It's the end of the quotation. As it happens, when Tony Steinbeck was translating the analyses, he came to all this talk about affect, and we talked about how to translate Rice, R-E-I-Z. Am I pronouncing correctly? He was most reluctant to translate it. I mean, Husserl doesn't talk that way. And he did settle on affective allure, which seemed to be appropriate to him, to me, and apparently to other readers since. Husserl's genetic investigations in general, and in particular his recognition that affective unities must be constituted in order for a world of objects to be constituted in subjectivity at all, are contrary to his earlier approaches. Steinbeck notes that passively synthesized affective unities enable a pre-reflective directedness that is at the core of intentionality. This affective core is continually supported by an environment that is cultural and historical as well as physical. Steinbeck discusses 5 significant features of the role of affection. First among them is that since affection lies at the heart of sense constitution, the original, more radical structure of intentionality comes to the fore. Intentionality is not a one-sided structure that stems from consciousness. It is bilateral, as it were. The object itself and the system of its horizontal referential implications elicits an orientation and pattern of constitution from the subject, beckoning the subject to peruse it more closely and participate in the formation of its sense from the very outset. From the side of the object to be given, there are enticements exerting a lure upon the subject. End of the quotation. These enticements, which are not cognitive or volitional, provide felt intensities that motivate action in one direction rather than another. They resist articulation even while making their mark on the successive levels of explicit bilateral intentionality. They provide an effective core at the heart of sense constitution that is revealed in a radically regressive process, still going back to the things themselves, but now further into the ongoing relational, historical, and social experience that is the source for individual sense of those things and intentional responses to them. I think that perhaps this affective core is best indicated by Eugene Gendron's use of elongated ellipses, 5 dots, to indicate the something that is present and influential, yet not susceptible to wording at all. Gendron's investigations, independent of, though I propose aligned with and useful for post-phenomenological research, focused on the not yet formed, that is, prior to language, yet continues to function still now after language. Genlin argued that this is done by the body, not by perception, and thus he acknowledged that his investigations moved further in the direction of Merleau-Ponty, who found the body's interaction and intentionality prior and presupposed in perception. The direction of that move is indicated by the title of the article from which I'm quoting, "The Primacy of the Body, Not the Primacy of Perception." Quoting further from that, "Perception is datum having, so it cannot be the basic form of life. The plant is an interaction directly with its environment. Its body does not first exist and only then interact. Rather, its growth and life processes consist of environmental interaction. And our bodies also consist of such environmental interaction processes." Genlin goes on to emphasize, plants are in contact with reality. They are interactions. Our own living bodies also are interactions with our environments, and that is not lost. Even though we often focus on the contributions of mind and will, so that bodily interactivity is forgotten, Genlin reminds us that we act from the bodily sense of each situation. The body's interactional intentionality must be understood as always still with us. It provides a direct bodily sense that you have and use all the time. Genlin provides this example. Suppose you are walking home late at night and you sense a group of men following you. You don't merely perceive them. You don't merely hear them there in the space behind you. Your body sense instantly includes also your hope that perhaps they aren't following you, also your alarm, and many past experiences, many more than we can list. It also implies a next move to cope with the situation. This familiar bodily sense of the intricacy of our situations, Genlin continues, is a felt sense, but not just an emotional reaction. Together with all the explicit thinking you can manage, and he says, if you or a companion have a lot of experience in streets in bad neighborhoods, bodily sense extends to possible next moves by relying upon this intricacy. Genlin is unwilling to credit this capacity to an unaccountable intuition. Rather, the living body is an ongoing interaction with its environment. It therefore is environmental information. That's Genlin's emphasis there. In reflecting on Genlin's argument for bodily primacy, embodied information, and implicit imagery, I notice that he does not use the words brain or mind, and am reminded of John Dewey's preference for the phrase body-mind, body-mind, as an essential unity of organized sensation. This is now quoting from Dewey. In the hyphenated phrase body-mind, body designates the continued and conserved, the registered and cumulative operations of factors continuous with the rest of nature, inanimate as well as animate, while mind designates the characters and consequences which are differential, indicative of features that emerge when the body is engaged in a wider, more complex and independent situation. Dewey goes on to emphasize the importance of this continuity. Unless vital organizations were organizations of antecedent natural events, the living creature would have no natural connections. It would not be pertinent to its environment, nor its environment relevant to it. Unless mind was an organization of physiological or vital affairs, and unless its functions developed out of the patterns of organic behavior, it would have no pertinency to nature. It's the end of the Dewey quotation. This organic process, inclusive of conserved bodily sense and explicit thinking, enables coping in complex situations. Whitehead characterized this intricate, ongoing relationality without need for neologism, quote, "The many become one and is increased by one." Ivy's theme, "The Key is Embodiment," echoes this focus on bodily interaction. and takes on increasing significance in relation to Husserl's investigation of passive synthesis as forming a level of primordial constitution that is precognitive, pre-predicative, and pre-personal. This primordial level of passive synthesis is shaped by inarticulate responses of a body to environmental clues. Thus, this core of primordial impressions is an interactive and even interrelational one. It is retained at a pre-predicative level of becoming that informs those walkers on the way home, in Jen's example. Husserl characterizes such incursion as luring our awareness. Particular features of the environment are appealing for an experiencer, who may then attend to those alluring features by virtue of apperceptions that implicitly enable, rather than implicitly enable, explicit concern, intentional concern. Prior to that explicit concern, however, we may become aware of the presence of felt intensities or primal impressions that are not traceable to volition or reason, are not in themselves intentional, and which remain as retentions within the stream of consciousness. Somebody is looking for you. Later moments in this process are incorporated within affective unities that lack the vivid allure of present primordial impressions, but remain on the horizon of time consciousness and can be revivified in later experiencing. As Steinbach notes, even though the affection may be slight, it can still reunite with a present sense and be reconstituted so as to exert a new force on the perceiver. In sum, because intentionality is a correlative structure, being able to be struck by an affective prominence of any kind presupposes consciousness is in principle an affective openness. I utilize what has become sedimented as me when, as an experiencer, I make decisions. A few words, several words, a lot of words, about affect as embodied intentionality. A post-phenomenological analysis of experience recognizes that things and humans practice a correlative intentionality, and both do so via their constitution. Attempting to use the claw end of a hammer to loosen a screw that's been driven into a plank demonstrates the frustration that results from neglecting the directionality incorporated in the purposes, aims, goals, and functions of the activity's participants. That is, on the part of both components of the action. There is no impartial basis for granting superior status to the intentionality of either the woodworker or the tool, as was done in Martin Peterson's criticism and characterization of the intentionality of technologies as weak and those of humans as strong. That valorization results from conceiving human intentionality directedness as reliant upon mentality, in contrast to the physical intentionality directedness of things, including technological artifacts. True, the woodworker can decide upon a more functional tool. The tool makes no decisions. Yet there is power in both. The woodworker decides, the tool enables or frustrates those decisions. What is enacted requires an intentionality that is embedded in both participants and draws upon the bilateral power in their relationship. In the environmental context of a particular goal, the tool provides a lure that a paintbrush would not. The woodworker retains prior experience of using the wrong tool, and so searches for the right one that lurks in the bottom of the toolbox. Insofar as we deny phenomenological intentionality to tools and technologies, we rely upon a metaphysics that valorizes individual minds in contrast to interactive bodies, rather than a metaphysics that understands both animate and inanimate entities, for instance, the woodworker and the hammer, as reciprocally emergent, as interrelationally constituted, and as effective in a variety of ways within experience. Excuse me again. So, in response to interviewers' questions focused on conceptions of phenomenology as a subjectivism focused on what's given and experienced, Don Eiler remarked, I don't think phenomenology returns to the given. This is one of the things that differentiate a critical phenomenological approach. Once you have been able to discover the possible multi-stability of a phenomenon, you can never return to it as a given. This is a myth about experience that I think is simply wrong. I went on to characterize a critical phenomenological approach as one in which the key is embodiment, which does not mean going to the limits of your skin, but also incorporating instruments and technologies. I take this extension of traditional phenomenology to include the history of how tools, instruments, and technologies have been, are, and might continue to be embedded in human bodies, actions, and capabilities. Post-phenomenological investigation of the things themselves is thereby extended from a static portrayal of the given, from what a focus of attention is, and even from what it is essentially. It's extended to inquiry to how our interrelations have been and are now enacted, how they come to be embodied as animate or inanimate things embedded within an environment, and how they may continue and even might best continue to be embedded, embodied, enacted, and extended in us and we in them. I'm referring there to a lot of research recently on the broader sense of the 4 E's: embeddedment, embodiment, enaction, and extension. Contemporary research on cognition as reliant upon these 4 E's adopts general common sense knowledge. All people are embodied. Our bodies, as well as our environments, are constantly changing. Other people, tools, technologies, and things have always been instrumental in our history, in that environment, and in our own changing ways of being. We could not have arrived at our current moment and could not presume to continue through future moments without those components of a dynamic and multi-stable environment in which we are immersed. The central place of affect is a further recognition of common sense, although it requires rethinking and revising the dismay that typically greets acknowledgement that the basis of decisions is emotional rather than logical. That rethinking can begin with Teresa Brennan's consideration of how affect is communicated. She opens the book entitled The Transmission of Affect with a question. Is there anyone who has not, at least once, walked into a room and felt the atmosphere? Close quote. She goes on to identify affect in breaching, breaking through, separation between our bodies and our environment. Another brief quotation. Affect, this is from Brennan, is a pre-personal, non-cognitive intensity that influences our moral reasoning via continual transmission, breaching the bounds between individual and environment. The senses and the flesh embody a logic that moves far faster than thought. So, affective felt intensities of interrelation among entities diminishes the possibility of understanding ourselves as separate from an environment of tools, instruments, technologies, and other animate and inanimate bodies. Variously and continually, individuals are directed toward interactions that operate in concert, at times in ways that are congenial and in other contexts in times and ways that are conflicted. Affect organizes the primordial level of that responsive engagement as it shapes directionality toward the environment, whether congenially or in opposition, and it can do so with or without our cognizance. Insofar as reasoning about interpersonal interaction, as well as about the design of artifacts, involves concern for the significance of one's decisions or actions, it requires that cognizance. Anthony Steinbach's summary of Husserl's investigation and analyses concerning active and passive synthesis identifies the effective force of the lure that invites attention at the primordial level of cognizance. Further analysis considers how that solicitation comes to prominence in the midst of multiple possible foci for existence. Also, given the dynamic context of that solicitation, his analysis considers how this direction might have been strengthened by a pre-reflective preferential directedness, giving an explicit attention to cognizance of past affectivity, primordial constitution, and the egoic engagement that develops on that basis, broadens analysis of the originating lure by turning toward considerations that provide a background for that interaction. Here also, attention focuses on what factors come to prominence and how passive affectivity influences egoic turning to particular factors and possibilities for action. Analysis can also attend to whether the response to the lure is one that enables a positive relation between participants, the reflective self, as well as others, and their environment. That is, one that enables satisfactory interrelatedness. The extent of positive rather than negative interaction is both like and unlike the past. Social life continually adds to that heritage, especially because what is recalled can expand from one's own experiencing to what is learned of others' experiences, both factual and is gleaned from historical and fictional sources. From this basis, we're able to imagine alternative ways for being and doing. I'll turn now to a consideration of Peter Paul Verbeek's work in doing and being in a relational reality. Quote briefly from Verbeek: "Reality arises in relations, as do the human beings who encounter it." Peter Paul Verbeek notes that he joins Idie's pragmatically colored interpretation of phenomenology by analyzing what things do and how that doing is an interaction with humans can be subject to moral inquiry, in a manner reminiscent of Jenlin's extension of Merleau-Ponty's focus on perception to one of bodily engagement. Verbeek extends Idie's initial focus on multi-stability in perceptual phenomena to designing artifacts that enable multi-stability in interaction with users. To accomplish that extension, Verbeek proposes that phenomenology's principal task is to analyze the relation between human beings and their world, rather than describing reality. Pursuing that task leads him to a post-phenomenology that overcomes the dichotomy between subject and objects, humans and world, by replacing it with a mutual interrelation. This insight informs his more radical phenomenological perspective, in which subject and object are not merely intertwined with each other, but constitute each other. From this perspective, Verbeek holds, things are not neutral intermediaries between humans and world, but mediators. They actively mediate a situation, a relation. Technologies like consciousness for Husserl have a certain directionality and intentionality, although not a determining influence, rather they promote or evoke particular ways of acting. The importance of bilateral intentionality deserves some emphasis. As he goes on to say, the ability of artifacts to co-shape the relation between human beings and world must not be conceived as an intrinsic property of the artifact itself. The effect of this misconception would be to smuggle back in again via the back door the old subject-object dichotomy, which it was precisely the triumph of phenomenology to have overcome. Verbeek quotes Idie here again: "Were technologies merely objects, totally divorced from human praxis, there would be so much junk lying around. Once taken into praxis, one can speak not of technologies in themselves, but as the active relational pair, human technology, with a dash. The insight that technologies cannot be separated from the use context," Verbeek adds, "implies that they have no essence. They are what they are only in their use." He notes that Idie calls such context dependence multi-stability. Verbeek's analysis of the design and use of artifacts retains this denial of essence and emphasizes the moral significance of artifacts' use, which relies upon a mutual intentionality. This is a radical phenomenological perspective that provokes a further implication. Acknowledging that insofar as humans, as well as technologies, cannot be separated from their use contexts implies that they, and we, have no essence. We are how we use an intentionality which is embedded within a multi-stable culture that is historical, material, political, and scientific, embodied in humans, enacted within praxis, and extended as the many become one and are increased by one, to borrow Whitehead's phrase. The overcoming of the old subject-object dichotomy in post-phenomenological investigation that reveals the multi-stability of bilateral intentionality also reveals that things are not neutral intermediaries between humans and world, but mediators. They actively mediate this relation, and so promote or evoke a distinct way of interacting. Verbeek's phenomenological investigation of this bilateral intentionality is attuned to moral significance. Identifying this ability provokes a new concern. How might moral significance be incorporated in our designs? Insofar as bilateral intentionality directs how artifacts are used in context and multi-stability is intrinsic to those contexts of usage, moral significance cannot be determined by designers' intentionality. The crucial question for an ethics of technology, Verbeek concludes, is how are we best to shape the interrelatedness between humans and technology that has always been a hallmark of the human condition? Actively shaping interrelatedness has not been a goal for phenomenological investigation. However, post-phenomenology enables an expanded agenda, a more radical phenomenological perspective in which subject and object are not merely intertwined with each other, but constitute each other. It's quoting Verbeek again. That expansion rejects traditional notions of cognition as a mental function rather than an embodied component of human being. Searle's analysis of the role of passive constitution and affective force in the primordial level of intentionality and constitution begins that expansion. Whitehead's understanding of humans as continually developing as we incorporate aspects of our environment, and Dewey's conception of mental functions as developing in patterns of organic behavior continues that expansion, as do Teresa Brennan's identification of affective intensity, Jenlin's investigation of embodied sense, Ides' demonstrations of multi-stability, and Verbeek's recognition of things as mediators. So, my conclusion. These remarks began with considering the extent to which post-phenomenology can resolve certain problems that Ken Lieberman identifies in phenomenology, classical phenomenology, namely an overemphasis on what is relational and a tendency to overly emphasize what is individual. Lieberman finds that these emphases lead to traps of the natural attitude. His own research avoids those traps as it enacts Psathas' reminder. The main aim of social science is not an understanding of behavior in the laboratory, but rather behavior where it occurs in everyday life. That ethnomethodological principle informs his conclusion that within the active syntheses that constitute the world, we are really examining the becoming of the world, a much more neutral occasion, midway between what is active and what is passive, in which what we receive exceeds what we deliberately organize. Despite then the tendencies in classical phenomenology that he identifies, Lieberman proposes that phenomenology and the human sciences have stood together in their efforts to escape what Eugen Fink has called the dogmatism of the natural attitude. All phenomenological disciplines seek to keep breaking through the naivete of that mundane thinking, which erects traps that confine our reflections. Briefly put, my thesis, Lieberman says, is that a synthesis of social science and phenomenology can study those traps more effectively than either one can do alone. Close quote. Briefly put, my own thesis is that Husserl's investigations of the life world and of both passive and active synthesis encourage post-phenomenological research that, by avoiding those traps, can reveal the interrelational origins of reason, where George Psathas taught us to look within behavior where it occurs in everyday life. Unquote.
Are you fine fielding your own questions?
Questions?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to field them for me? Would you like to answer them for
I
me?
won't answer them, but...
Any questions at all? Comments? Yes, please.
Thank you, Lenore, for that presentation. Just, it strikes me that some of the comments, particularly most of the comments you make in your talk, are actually sort of making essential claims in a way. And it's a reflective, it's a highly reflective, and they're better essential claims. I mean, to start saying that things always need to be considered in their context and how they work, and there's my intentionality, strikes me, those are all sort of eidetic claims that really, I just think it's sort of, we're always using it, but not reflecting on it, and it's there. But it can achieve the very goals you're talking about trying to escape from some of the problems of too individualistic of a kind of phenomenology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's the multi-stability of essences right there, right? As more of us consider them, reflect on them, they're going to look different. Even for those of us that come at them from much the same kind of a cultural and historical background, we'll find radical differences. All of what I've said in my own thinking is contextualized by our current political situations, where difference is very, very apparent. Thanks. Yeah.
So, thank you for the presentation. I'm glad to, it's wonderful to hear you again. So, I was wondering if I really like the tentative of the affect and affection, and that seems to be making like a revival lately. I've noticed in some of the phenomenological psychology, and I think there's an affect theory reader by Sarah Ahmed, and so I really like that you made that connection. That's my favorite one. Actually, my second favorite part in Husserl, the allurement, the allurement of affect, the affect of objects from the passive active synthesis text is really beautiful, and so it's interesting, to make that grounding in phenomenology and Husserl, because I think the origins of a lot of that is coming from like a emotion theory of some types. Some of the phenomenological psychologists are trying to do this as a non-empirical approach to the emotion. That's sort of my very, I'm not an expert in that. I'm wondering if you've come across on this affect theory, this new renaissance of it, and what your sort of thoughts are. I mean, if it feels very phenomenological, and I'm glad that you made that sort of, showing here's this, notion of affect is really important in Husserl. So.
Yeah, it's turned both ways. The affect revolution, or the evolution of thinking about affect, it can be the sort of thing you mentioned that is very psychological in orientation. It's interesting that both Whitehead and Husserl, when they use that term, insist that it's not emotional, right? Mm-hmm. It's what's coming at us when we don't know it's coming at us, and we only maybe sometimes later in reflection realize what came to us. Mm-hmm. And emotion is another level that can come from, be a development from affect, but they're not to be the same thing for either Whitehead or Husserl. Very definitely, they both mention it. I don't mean anything squishy here. Right? In fact, it's hard to imagine Whitehead putting it quite that way, but if he could have, he would have. Right? And I mentioned that it happened that Tony Steinbach and I were both talking about problems in the translation while he was doing it. We were both teaching at SIU then. And he was so reluctant to use those terms, allure. Husserl never talks about allure. That sounds like a perfume commercial. I remember him saying at some point, Tony saying, right? So it's radical talk for phenomenologists. But it certainly gets away from that claim that it's all rationality, right, and individuality. it's intrinsic, allure is intrinsically, unless yourself can be an allure for yourself, that doesn't make much sense to me, but maybe I'm missing something, and somebody else will tell me. But normally, allure speaks of at least two bodies, persons, entities, in combination, in interrelation, right? So it sounds at first like very un-Husserlian kind of talk, but it's there. It is there. And he came to see it only very late on. Merleau-Ponty read those manuscripts, right, and acknowledged his reliance upon them. But they weren't available for many, many years. Even in German, there was some 20 years separation between publication of the Crisis and the analyses. Mm-hmm. So they don't commonly get associated with radically rational Husserl type stuff, right? It's interesting that they've only recently come to the fore at the same time that we have this other interest, growing interest in affect. I first came to this by listening to Jean Genlin at the time, I think, when must have been when Speck was meeting in Chicago. Mm-hmm. Jen spoke to us. And it was just eye-opening, right? Never thought about that in connection with phenomenology before, but he saw it, Genlin saw it. Mm-hmm. From his place, again, a multidisciplinary place between psychology and philosophy. Thanks. Any more comments or questions? Interest? Yes, please.
I'm really fascinated by bilateral intentionality and its connection to pragmatism. Mm-hmm. It seems to me that there's something going on there with pragmatism. Though they didn't call it that, there was very much that interactional element. I'm thinking about George Herbert Mead's famous saying in Philosophy of the Act, and he says that it's not only the hand that shapes the hammer, but the hammer also the hand.
Yes. Yeah, and it's in Dewey. It goes all back to the intentional arc. I've forgotten the date for Dewey and the intentional arc. It's way, way back there. And his insistence that the intentional arc is a circle, right? It includes the intentionality, he didn't use that term, of both, whatever it is. I'm thinking the example of the candle flame, the child approaching the candle, right? It takes the two to create the fright or the burn or the pulling back, right? It is always a circle, but we tend to separate, radically separate that and this, in part because we're focused on the mind is in this, it's not in the candle flame. But it's the intentionality of both that create the scene. Dewey saw this way back a long time ago. And one of my graduate school colleagues who later became a Dewey expert has always said, Lenore, someday you'll discover that Merleau-Ponty and Husserl and all those people, well, Dewey had them all before them. And okay, in a sense so. And I guess that sense is why I wish we kept with pragmatic phenomenology, that at least lets you separate the syllables in the middle, whereas post-phenomenology has me stumbling still after all this time. Thanks for your comment, by the way. Anyone else? Yes? I see tired people, especially those that have been through 4 days of spec before this. And that reminds me to thank you all for being here this evening. Several people mentioned to me this afternoon that they had to be leaving until they get home before the deer come out. And I'm glad that you all decided to stay even though the deer are out there. So be careful when you're going anywhere.
Well, let's say thank you to Lenore. We can actually retire to the bar if people want to continue more informal conversations. I recommend doing that. So.
Sounds like a good idea.
All right. Well, thank you, Lenore.